You ever notice how life can get cluttered even when nothing significant is wrong? You're doing your best, checking every box, showing up for everyone, holding everything together, yet something inside still feels misaligned. It's like carrying a bag that keeps getting heavier even though you haven't added anything new to it. You feel the weight, but you can't point to a single reason why it's there. And that's usually the moment God whispers, not loudly, not forcefully, but in that quiet, persistent way He does. You're carrying things you were never meant to carry because you started without me. There's something powerful about beginnings. The first step you take sets the pace. The first voice you listen to shapes your direction. The first thing you reach for reveals what your heart depends on. And when God isn't first, everything else ends up fighting for a place it was never designed to fill. We chase peace from people who can't give it. We chase clarity from circumstances that can't provide it. We chase purpose from achievements that can't sustain it. But when God becomes first, suddenly the things that once felt heavy don't carry the same weight anymore because the order changed. Order determines outcome. It's like buttoning a shirt. If the first button is wrong, every other button falls out of line, no matter how hard you try to fix the lower ones. You can be talented, focused, disciplined, hardworking, and still off if the first thing isn't the right thing. A lot of frustration in life comes not from doing the wrong things, but from doing things in the wrong order. We want God to bless what's second, strengthen what's third, and fix what's fourth, when He already told us He works from the top down. He said, seek me first, not because He needs attention, but because you need alignment. Putting God first changes your perspective. Suddenly your problems stop looking like giants and start looking like opportunities. Not because they got smaller, but because your focus got bigger. When God is at the center, fear stops being the loudest voice. Anxiety stops being the default mode. Chaos stops being the familiar rhythm. When God becomes your starting point, He becomes your lens. And once you start viewing life through His lens, you realize how many things were never as impossible as they appeared. You stop asking, how will I get through this? And start believing if God is first, He will lead me through it. Putting God first doesn't eliminate storms. It anchors you in them. Some people think God first means a storm-free life, but it really means a storm-proof heart. When God is first, the waves don't dictate direction. The wind doesn't dictate identity. The storm doesn't dictate outcome. Because what's first in your life becomes what stabilizes your life. Without God first, everything shakes. With God first, even the shaking doesn't break you. Putting God first transforms you from the inside out. It's interesting how we pray for God to change our situation when most of the time His first move is to change us. We want Him to fix the environment, but He wants to reshape the internal environment. When God is first in your heart, you begin to react differently, speak differently, choose differently, desire differently. You start walking in peace you can't explain, making decisions you once avoided, letting go of things that used to control you. The transformation is internal long before it ever shows up externally. What changes inside eventually changes everything around you. Putting God first is not a single decision, it's a daily rhythm. It's the posture you take before the world starts demanding your attention. It's waking up and saying, God, before I put my hands on anything today, I'm putting my heart on you. It's choosing Him first in your thoughts, your priorities, your motives, your responses. It's making room for Him, not after life gets crazy, but before it does. And the more consistently you choose God as your first, the more naturally everything else begins to fall into its rightful place. There comes a moment in every believer's life where the noise of everything else gets so loud that the absence of God's voice becomes noticeable. Not because He stopped speaking, but because life crowded Him out. You start noticing that your patience is thinner, your peace is shorter, your joy is unstable, and your decisions feel heavier. It's not that life suddenly became harder, it's that God stopped being first. And when God is not first, even simple things feel overwhelming. Putting God first isn't about adding Him to your schedule. It's about giving Him authority over it. It's not squeezing Him into your day. It's inviting Him to shape your day, because the moment God moves from being something you carry to the one who carries you, things shift. Stress becomes manageable. Worry loses its grip. Pressure stops directing your steps. You begin to realize that the peace you were trying to create on your own was never yours to manufacture. It was always His to give. Many people want transformation without reordering their priorities. They want God to fit into the life they've already built, instead of allowing God to rebuild the life He always intended for them. But the truth is, God cannot be second and still be God. He cannot be a backup plan, an emergency contact, a last resort, or a spiritual Band-Aid. The moment He's anything less than first, everything else suffers. When God isn't first, even blessings feel like burdens. Even opportunities feel overwhelming. Even success feels empty because order was never established. Putting God first sharpens your spiritual vision. When God is at the top, you stop looking at life through the lens of fear and begin seeing through the lens of faith. You stop interpreting challenges as punishments and start seeing them as preparation. You stop letting emotions dictate decisions and start letting truth anchor them. The same situation that once caused panic now produces perseverance. The same season that once made you question God now deepens your dependence on Him. This is what happens when He becomes the priority rather than the afterthought. When God is first, relationships change. You stop expecting people to be your source and start appreciating them as gifts. You stop placing divine expectations on human beings. You stop needing approval to feel secure. Stop letting rejection rewrite your identity. People no longer become the foundation of your worth because God already settled it. And when God is first, you can love people better, not because they are perfect, but because your heart is positioned correctly. Putting God first also transforms your inner battles. The fears you once amplified start shrinking. The lies you once believed lose their authority. The temptations that once felt impossible to resist begin losing power. Because whatever sits first in your life becomes what shapes your strength. When God is leading, you're no longer fighting with your own power, you're fighting with His. And suddenly, the battles that used to defeat you now develop you. When you put God first, clarity replaces confusion. You begin to understand that life isn't happening to you, it's happening through you. You begin recognizing divine opportunities that you would have overlooked. You start discerning seasons instead of reacting to them. You start making decisions based on purpose instead of pressure. There's a supernatural alignment that happens when God takes His rightful place at the top. But putting God first is not just a spiritual concept, it's a lifestyle. It's choosing Him over comfort, choosing Him over convenience, choosing Him over the hurried pace of your own plans. It's inviting Him into the spaces you used to guard. It's trusting Him with the areas you once concealed. It's giving Him authority over your desires, your agenda, your ambitions, and your identity. And it's doing it daily, consistently, and intentionally, not because life is easy, but because you have discovered that nothing works right when God isn't first. There is something that happens in the human heart when God takes His rightful place. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's not always emotional. Sometimes it's subtle. A calm thought, a shift in perspective, a weight you didn't realize you were carrying suddenly lifting, a confidence rising where uncertainty used to live. That's the evidence of what happens when God moves from being an option to being the foundation of everything you pursue, decide, and desire. When God is first, life doesn't magically lose its challenges, but your capacity to handle those challenges expands. You begin to realize that most of your exhaustion was never caused by what you were facing, but by the fact that you were facing it without the right alignment. Misalignment creates unnecessary effort. When God isn't first, things that should be simple become draining. Conversations become heavier, decisions become complicated, choices feel impossible. You start reacting from emptiness instead of responding from overflow, and that's what makes life feel harder than it should be. Putting God first brings order to your inner world. There's a reason Scripture emphasizes seeking Him before anything else. It's not because God demands attention, it's because your soul requires direction. Without God first, desires pull you one way, fears pull you another, expectations add pressure from every side, and suddenly you find yourself stretched thin between responsibilities that God never wanted you to carry alone. But when God becomes the priority, clarity begins replacing chaos. You start recognizing what deserves your attention and what doesn't. You stop chasing every opportunity and start embracing divine assignments. You begin to realize that not everything that comes your way was meant for you, and not everything you lose was meant to stay. When God is first, your identity stabilizes. You stop defining yourself by what you have, what you do, or what people think of you. You stop letting comparisons dictate your confidence. You stop letting failures define your worth. You stop letting insecurity disrupt your peace. Your identity becomes rooted in something immovable. You're no longer trying to prove who you are because God already affirmed who you are. That kind of identity brings a strength that circumstances can't erode and people can't dismantle. Putting God first shifts the way you interpret time. You stop rushing through seasons, trying to force outcomes, trying to accelerate what isn't ready. You begin trusting the timing of God. You understand that delay is not denial and waiting is not wasted. You begin to see that God's timing is a gift, even when it feels slow. You start recognizing that some doors don't open because what's behind them would crush you right now. You stop fighting the pace God is leading you at because you finally believe that He is not withholding anything good from you. When God is first, strength begins to rise in places where you were once fragile. What used to break you no longer intimidates you. What used to overwhelm you no longer controls you. You start stepping into situations with confidence, not because you feel qualified, but because you feel led. There's a boldness that grows in you when you know you are backed by the one who sees the whole picture. You stop hesitating. You stop doubting every decision. You stop second guessing your purpose. You start walking with assurance that God is guiding every step. Putting God first redefines your capacity for gratitude. You start noticing blessings you used to overlook. You stop rushing past moments of grace. You stop focusing on what you lack and start appreciating what you have. Gratitude grows naturally when God is first because you're no longer measuring your life by what's missing, but by the faithfulness you've already witnessed. And gratitude shifts the atmosphere of your entire life. It transforms your attitude, your conversations, your relationships, your expectations. You begin living from a place of fullness instead of frustration. When God is first, you begin to live with intention instead of reaction. You stop being tossed around by circumstances and start being guided by conviction. You start waking up with purpose, moving with clarity, and resting with peace. You make decisions that reflect your values instead of your fears. You let go of things that once held you hostage. You develop the courage to walk away from what doesn't align with God's direction for your life. You become more grounded, more focused, more resilient, and more surrendered because everything changes when the one who created you becomes the one who leads you. There is a quiet kind of transformation that begins the moment God takes His rightful place in your priorities. It doesn't always start with fireworks or emotional moments. Sometimes it begins with a small decision made in an ordinary day. Sometimes it starts with a simple prayer whispered in exhaustion. Sometimes it begins with a surrender that feels more like a sigh than a spiritual milestone. But that shift, as subtle as it may seem, begins rearranging the architecture of your entire life. Because the presence of God doesn't need volume to create impact. It just needs space. And when you give Him first place, everything in your life begins responding to that new order. Putting God first changes the way you carry responsibility. You stop treating life like it's all on your shoulders. You stop living with the pressure of trying to be your own provider, your own protector, your own planner, and your own strength. You start releasing things instead of hoarding them. You start trusting instead of fearing. You start resting instead of striving. And life begins to feel lighter, not because circumstances changed, but because your posture did. When God is first, you stop operating from depletion and start moving from dependence on Him. There's a flow to life that comes when you are no longer fighting battles that belong to God. When God is first, your decisions become clearer. You stop seeking clarity from unstable sources. You stop needing constant reassurance from people who can only see parts of the picture. You stop making choices based on emotions that shift with every hour. You start leaning into wisdom that doesn't change. God begins guiding you in ways that don't always make sense, but always prove themselves right. You find yourself making choices that shock your old patterns. You choose peace over panic, purpose over pressure, surrender over control, growth over comfort. And every time you choose an alignment with God, you feel that internal confirmation that says, this is the way, keep walking. Putting God first also transforms the way you see challenges. You stop interpreting resistance as rejection. You stop assuming obstacles mean you're off track. You stop panicking every time something slows down. Instead, you start discerning what God might be developing in you through the struggle. You begin to realize that some battles come not to break you, but to build the strength you'll need for the next season. You start recognizing that trials have purpose and that God's presence in the difficulty is more important than the removal of the difficulty. When God is first, you begin to trust that He is working even when you can't see progress. When God is first, relationships shift in noticeable ways. People who were once central lose their grip on your identity. People who once influenced your decisions begin losing the authority they shouldn't have had. You stop letting people's reactions determine your obedience. You stop shrinking yourself to keep the peace. You stop tying your joy to how others treat you. God becomes your anchor, and the voices around you stop being dictators of your destiny. With God first, you learn how to love people without idolizing them, help people without losing yourself, and forgive people without reopening old wounds. Putting God first awakens confidence that isn't rooted in ego, but in calling. You start stepping into things you used to avoid. You start believing you are capable of assignments you once ran from. You start walking with a quiet boldness, not because you trust yourself more, but because you trust God more deeply. Fear doesn't disappear, but it loses authority. Doubt may still knock, but it no longer gets the final word. You become courageous in a way that surprises even you, because God's presence has a way of strengthening what once felt fragile. When God is first, your understanding of success changes. You stop measuring your worth by outcomes. You stop chasing achievement for validation. You stop feeling behind because someone else is ahead. You start seeing success as obedience rather than applause. You begin valuing peace over popularity, purpose over performance, calling over comfort, and this shift refines your motives. It purifies your ambitions. It aligns your desires with what God uniquely designed you to do. You begin to realize that the greatest success is walking in sync with the one who knows your beginning, middle, and end. When God is first, every other part of your life begins responding to that alignment, because order always invites transformation, and nothing stays the same when God becomes the priority above everything else. There is a kind of clarity that only comes when God becomes the starting point of your life instead of the add-on you reach for when everything falls apart. It's the clarity that comes when your spirit finally exhales because the weight of self-reliance has lifted. It's the clarity that settles in when the noise of worry begins to quiet, not because circumstances shifted, but because your focus did. When God is first, the fog that once clouded your decisions begins to lift. You begin to distinguish between what matters and what merely demands attention. You begin to feel the difference between pressure that comes from fear and direction that comes from God. When God is first, peace becomes more than a feeling you chase. It becomes a place you live. It becomes a posture. It becomes a protection. You stop viewing peace as something that appears when everything is calm. You start seeing it as something God gives even when everything is chaotic. You realize that peace isn't the result of external order. It's the result of internal surrender. And when God has first place, that surrender becomes easier because you were no longer fighting to control what God already promised to handle. Putting God first changes your relationship with time. You stop panicking about delays. You stop assuming detours mean disaster. You stop rushing ahead of God out of fear that you're running out of moments. Instead, you begin trusting that God knows not just the right destination, but the right pace. You start recognizing that the doors God doesn't open protect you as much as the doors He does. You begin seeing waiting not as punishment, but as preparation. And with that shift, you stop living in a hurry and start living in harmony with God's timing, which is always perfect, even when it doesn't match your expectations. When God is first, your confidence becomes rooted in something stable. You stop relying on compliments to feel secure. You stop collapsing under criticism. You stop tying your worth to your productivity. You begin to understand that who you are is anchored in who created you, not in what you achieve. You can walk into rooms without needing validation. You can face challenges without needing to prove yourself. You can pursue your purpose without needing applause. That kind of confidence isn't loud or boastful. It's steady, it's quiet, it's unshakable, and it flows from knowing that God is not behind you, not beside you, but leading you. Putting God first also transforms your emotional responses. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop letting fear run ahead of truth. You stop allowing anxiety to set the tone of your day. Instead, you respond from a place of centeredness. You start breathing before breaking. You start praying before panicking. You start listening before assuming. You start recognizing triggers that once controlled you and realizing they no longer hold the same power. It's not that emotions disappear. It's that they stop being the drivers of your decisions because your spirit is now anchored in something stronger than how you feel in the moment. When God is first, your dreams take on a new depth. You stop dreaming small out of fear. You stop limiting yourself because of past disappointments. You stop treating God like he can only do what seems logical. Instead, you begin believing that he can do what is supernatural. Your prayers get bolder. Your imagination expands. Your expectations elevate. You start believing that God can resurrect what you thought was dead, open what you thought was closed, and multiply what you thought was too little. You begin living with anticipation rather than dread because you trust the one who holds your future. Putting God first reorders your desires. You begin wanting what aligns with his heart rather than what distracts from your purpose. You crave peace more than attention. You seek wholeness more than validation. You desire transformation more than temporary relief. You begin to let go of patterns that once felt familiar but were actually holding you back. You release habits that kept you cycling in the same frustration. You loosen your grip on what you thought you needed and open your hands to what God has prepared